Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Cara Finnegan. Thank you for joining me. Dr. Finnegan has a book coming out, Photographing Presidents Making History from Daguerreotypes to Digital. Tell us how you got interested in this topic. It's a bit of a unique focus on history here.
Yeah, it's kind of a mashup between presidential history and photography history.
Yeah.
And it really started because of my teaching. I teach courses in visual politics at the University of Illinois down in Urbana-Champaign, and
if I can interject, you did this from a rhetorical perspective, I assume. Your degrees in communication studies from Northwestern, I believe, right?
Yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah. So I'm really interested in how visual images work persuasively in the public sphere. And in my visual politics course, we've always done a unit on presidents. And when Obama was in the first months of his first term in 2009, I noticed they started doing some really interesting things where they were taking photographs that they made officially at the White House, photographs that would normally be, saved for history, preserved in the future presidential library. They started putting them online on this social media photography site called Flickr.
Which almost devalues them, doesn't it?
In some ways it does, and that was what was interesting to me. So it's like, how do you reconcile a photograph made ostensibly for historical purposes? What were they doing? What sort of image about Obama were they trying to convey? And so I started working through these images with my students. And like a good professor, I thought, well, I need to go, read a book about the history of presidents and photography. And then lo and behold, I didn't really find what I was looking for. So it was kind of one of those classic professor moments of like, well, I guess I have to write this book then.
Right. That's very interesting. And I know from your book that you found that at the beginning of photographing the presidents in the early years, it was an extremely formal relationship that they had with photography. So we go from something that's extremely formal to something that becomes rather informal when we get to Obama, right? What were the constraints that they were under? And who were the first presidents to be photographed?
The first president to be photographed is actually a photograph we no longer have, and that is William Henry Harrison in 1841. We know he sat for a daguerreotype, which was the first type of photograph that became popular in the United States. And photography came in 1839, so just a few years later.
For a daguerreotype, you had to sit for 30 minutes or more without moving because it was exposed very slowly?
The exposure times were pretty slow, and the challenge was literally to keep your eyes open. So John Quincy Adams, who in 1842, when he first sat for a daguerreotype, by that point he was an ex-president, but he complained that they made the photo and I dozed and the photo was asleep. So we can assume that he was unhappy because his daguerreotype, showed him with closed eyes.
Well, and another one of the early photographs was of a portrait of Washington, was it not?
Yes.
And how did that come? I understand that was extremely popular, and people had copies of the photograph, and they took pictures of people holding the photograph, and
Washington got around photographically, which is funny because he died 40 years before photography was even invented. And that was really interesting to me because it never occurred to me, knowing what I knew about the history of photography, that Washington would be a big player. But he was. And I think the reason for that, and what I talk about in the book, is that he was such an important figure. He was really the most important American. He was,
they were worshipful about him.
Right, literally. And, well into the late 19th century, he was kind of the dominant figure. And so to make a photograph of a painting of Washington or a bust of Washington, that was as close as you could get to the man himself.
And before photography, you had to go travel to a museum or someplace to actually see a portrait of him.
Yeah, exactly. And you might have had popular, prints in your home, but the idea of having a photograph of a person who was never photographed, to me, what that really pointed out was how much photography needed that authority of the presidents. They were so bound up with each other that to become a really recognizable public art, photography turned to the most popular subject, which was at that time George Washington.
And the photo that was reproduced the most was of an unfinished painting. Am I right? It was.
Yes, there's a famous unfinished head of and bust, I guess, of George Washington, a painting that was the model for a number of paintings, including a famous painting that hangs in the White House today called the Lansdowne Portrait. That head of Washington by Gilbert Stuart is also the head that's on our dollar bills, so we see it every time we look at our money.
Yeah, we're still reproducing it.
Yeah, exactly. And what was important about photographing that portrait, I think, for the photographers, was that was a portrait that was known to be painted from life. So again, you could have, that was the closest you could get to a photograph of Washington.
I see. If you look at it with the deep historical perspective, I guess that portrait of Washington would have to rank up there with the most reproduced images because it goes back so far.
Yeah, and it's funny, someone in the late 19th century, there was sort of a dispute about what was the portrait of Washington that looked the most like him and therefore was the most authentic. And a literary critic famously said in the late 19th century, if Washington came back today to life and he didn't look like that portrait, we wouldn't believe it was him, right? So that idea that the image at that point was more important than the man would have been.
Well, it's outlived him.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Quite a bit. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, so then, which president was the one that was photographed the most? Who really embraced this initially? I mean, at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's really interesting about the earliest period of photography is the extent to which photographers reached out to elite figures, men, mostly presidents, to invite them to come and pose. And the idea there was that, if I invite former President John Quincy Adams to sit and then I display his image in my gallery, well, that shows how important I am, right? And that shows the quality of my work.
And then I can come and pay a lot of money to sit in the same chair and get my picture taken, maybe with the same pose, right?
Exactly, yeah. So it's sort of, photography is a democratic medium, but it links you to the elite figures in that way. As photography matures, Abraham Lincoln becomes a really important person. A lot of people think he is the most photographed person of the era. In fact, the most photographed person of the 19th century, many scholars have said, is Frederick Douglass, the African-American activist and orator. But Lincoln was very interested in technology. He was very interested in photography. His first photograph was made while he was still in Springfield, Illinois.
Really?
And especially when he became president, and was first running for president and then became president, he regularly visited the photography studios in Washington.
Yeah, and Matthew Brady was being paid by the government to photograph the Civil War. Was Lincoln affiliated with that, I wonder?
They were, Lincoln was a subject for Brady at his studio. In fact, Lincoln famously declared that when he won the 1860 election, he was photographed the same day he gave a famous speech in New York City known as the Cooper Union speech. And that was kind of the big one, right, that established Lincoln's this viable candidate from the West. And that same day, he went with his friends and he sat for a portrait with Brady. And Lincoln's famous statement later was, Brady and Cooper Union made me president. That this photograph circulated in the form of engravings on the cover of magazines. Harper's put it on their cover to commemorate his election several months later. So even as a candidate, Lincoln understood that this medium was really valuable. And then when he became president, he sat often enough that I think kind of tragically, you can look at the impact of the war on his face and on his body in these photographs.
Yeah, I've often noticed that. I think it's, it's more striking, I think, than any other example I can think of.
Yeah, and the presidency famously ages everybody, but the Lincoln images, because they were taken over such a comparatively short amount of time, are really shocking in that way.
Well, and then, if I go back for just a second, because something else that really intrigues me about this is the photographs actually lend some importance and legitimacy and some substance to the presidency, in a sense, right? Because here we're making this new experiment in government, right? And that's obvious, you can see that. But I wonder if, to some extent, it isn't true that the fact that people were associating photographs with the presidency and with important people, if that doesn't lend some legitimacy to the photograph itself, that it makes it more desirable for someone to have their portrait taken because the president did, right? And what do you think about that? And has that lingered with us?
Yeah, I think it really has, and especially early on, that was the earliest photographers were very, very interested in tapping into that presidential authority, getting the attention of the elites.
Yeah.
One of the first people from France to come to the United States to demonstrate this new medium of the daguerreotype, gave performances, essentially public performances, where you could go and see him do it from beginning to end, all the chemistry, and he announced at the end.
It's very much like a magic act, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and that's what
way.
people really thought. They used words like wonder, right? That it's just this amazing, wonderful thing, literally full of wonder. And at the end of his performances, he would say, and this is the first daguerreotype ever made in the United States, and I'm going to give it to the president. And it was kind of this flourish, as if to say that even from the very beginning, this art was so important and was going to be so valuable that, of course, a president would be interested. And we have to think about it too in the context, as you said, of science and technology. So it's a new technology that is being brought to a country that is deeply embracing all kinds of other new technologies at the same time.
Well, it's just always been curious to me, though, that today we take action shots of one another. I at one point in my career was doing employee communication. I wanted to get shots of the employees working and doing things and not posing, because they'd all look the same. Newspapers don't want posed pictures. They call them grip and grins, and they refuse to print them. But we tend to do that. People want to pose when they're in a photograph. It's very interesting. It's stayed with us all these years,
Yeah, and the ways we pose are different.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's usually the inclination, is to pose. And when we get into the late 19th and early 20th century, the rise of candid photography, which comes about because you've got smaller cameras and people can sort of lurk around and catch you off guard.
And to my mind, that's much more revealing.
Yeah, and it sets a whole other standard in terms of norms. And then you've got the growing value of those kinds of images. And then now, of course, we have, I think, a kind of merger where we pose in a candid way, right? So we combine those two things, as you said.
Well, so as we tell us about this candid phase that we move into in the 20th century.
Beginning in the late 19th century, you begin to get anxieties about what people started to call camera fiends, which we can think of as sort of a little bit of a precursor to the paparazzi, right? The person with the cameras lurking around. People can walk around with cameras in public, and they're so small. They really weren't small compared to the way we have them in our phones, but they were small enough that you could move around undetected. Yeah. And so,
in fact, it's illegal today to take someone's picture in public in Paris.
Yeah. And there are famous cases. Grover Cleveland's wife, I believe, Frances Folsom Cleveland, who was a very attractive younger woman, a photograph of her was reused in, I think it was a corset ad. So there was this kind of shock of, advertisers starting to use all kinds of photographs without permission. And so it's kind of the Wild West.
And today that's legally a violation of privacy, I think.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so you get in this transition, in the late 19th and early 20th century, where on the one hand, you've got this rise of professional photojournalism, and they're beginning to develop their own norms and rules and ethics. And then you have, the anxiety about the camera fiends, people with professionals and amateurs with smaller cameras who can, catch you with food in your mouth or picking your nose or, any of the sort of indecorous things. Right. And of course, all of this anxiety is increased for presidents because they're on view all the time anyway.
So Woodrow Wilson had an encounter with someone, I believe, right?
Yes, Woodrow Wilson goes on vacation just after he's elected. So he is technically a president-elect. He's in Bermuda, and he goes on a little bike ride. He's got his teenage daughter with him. And, there's reporters there because he's now the president-elect, and they're photographers, and they're staking out the place where he's staying. And he arrives back, and the story goes, as it was reported by the New York Times, that he showed up and he saw the photographers and said, okay, guys, here's the thing. You can take all the pictures of me you want. We're a little disheveled. We've just come back from this bike ride. But please don't take a picture of my daughter because she doesn't want to be photographed that way. And the story is that somebody snapped, and the phrase was snapped his daughter, which I find really fascinating. And someone took a picture of her.
Because they were big clunky cameras,
right,
and I'm sure you could hear them click.
Exactly. And so Wilson sort of lost it and reportedly, went up to this photographer and said, if I weren't a gentleman, I would punch you in the face, right? And so the headline in the New York Times was something like, Wilson threatens to punch photographer. And so you get this sense of that anxiety about the public and the private, and the understandable inclination of a president, especially wanting to protect their family members, not to have their privacy violated when they're not performing any public function. But at the same time, the press has a desire to report on news, and the president is almost always news. So that's a funny example, but it really gets in some ways to the heart of the matter.
You think of Wilson as being this kind of stuffed shirt anyway. It's hard to imagine that.
Get
that worked out.
Right, and he got his paternal ire up in this case, I guess.
And then when we get to Franklin Roosevelt, there's a complication because of his polio, right?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because one of the things that I expected when I started to look at Roosevelt was I thought I would end up writing mostly about the famous, complicated efforts to essentially cover up his disability.
Is that true?
My take on it is it really isn't, that there were norms and rules that were given to photographers who largely followed those rules. Don't photograph him when he's being carried, because he was often carried, from a building to a car. Don't photograph him in a wheelchair. Don't photograph him when he's using crutches. So there were absolutely these kind of visual, prohibitions. But
these were tacit, you think? They weren't?
They were, I would say, openly tacit, if you can put it that way. That it was sort of known that if, pretty quickly, and also from the time he had been governor, it was kind of known that this is how you needed to do things. On the other hand, Roosevelt was very open about his disability. He advocated very much for what today we might call disability rights during his presidency. And often he verbally referenced his disability. But what was interesting to me from the photography perspective was that they were, his advisors, from what I could piece together, were just as worried about the kind of general photographs of Roosevelt as anything else. So there's a kind of complicated series of stories about Roosevelt being photographed eating a hot dog, at a Democratic Party picnic, and that was indecorous. And this example kept coming up over and over again in the conversations of, you can't just take photographs of people doing anything, right? And so another famous example was when Popular Photography magazine kind of reported on this controversy over the so-called candid camera, which those of us from the 20th century know about 35 millimeter cameras, the ones we grew up on. That's what they're referring to. That's what they're calling the candid camera. And you could take a photograph of somebody with a candid camera, with a 35 millimeter camera, blow it up to print it in a newspaper, and it would actually look pretty bad, because it just wouldn't have very good resolution. And so if people photograph Roosevelt that way, the press office didn't like it because they thought he looked sick. There were always anxieties about Roosevelt's health. He battled questions about his health from the time he was first elected. And so you have all of these anxieties that were related to the disability, but that really wasn't the whole story. They were just more worried about how their guy looked in public.
The same thing everybody else was worried about.
Exactly. And that was really fascinating to me.
Well, and then if we jump ahead to Obama, right, how does that play? Was there less of a concern for that?
With Obama, what became really interesting to me was the extent to which our current world, which at that time, in 2009 was our new world of social media, essentially allows presidents to bypass the mainstream media almost entirely. So they can kind of become their own photography agency in ways that previous presidents had only dreamed of. And so with Obama, what you get is this kind of escalation of what I would call the push-pull between the press and the president. So when Obama puts out pictures of himself at an event, that's viewed as public relations. When a photographer photographs Obama doing roughly the same thing at the same event, that's news. Yeah. And those boundaries in the era of social media, they get pretty funky pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, how do you think that speaks to this notion of photography lending something to the importance and stature of the presidency? If it becomes too accessible, does it have an impact on the president's stature?
What Obama did, and what his chief photographer, Pete Souza, who is clearly a master, right, at his craft, what he did was he essentially established norms that were in place before Obama, but that really solidified. And that norm is you need to show the president as both a leader of character, right, of good character, and you need to show the president as a real person. And what the Obama administration did better than anybody else, because they were doing it essentially in real time, was they were able to create that kind of dual image simultaneously. And so what you got was a picture of Obama that was pretty consistent, you know? The Obama playing with babies in Halloween costumes and the Obama in a cabinet meeting, after a while, start to look like the same guy, right? Yeah. And that is a kind of masterful construction, but it also represents, I think, a kind of a way of documenting presidents that has now set up norms for everybody else. So, Trump is an example of if you look at the way that the Trump administration photographed Trump and the way that Trump appeared in nearly every other context, those images are pretty distinct from one another. Like, there's not a lot of consistency, right? And Trump did not let in the cameras for those moments where he was, making a tough decision or interacting with people, in his office. And Sousa's photographs of Obama really allow you to see all of that. So now we expect that. We want that president to be both the leader of character that John Quincy Adams wanted and the guy who plays with babies on the floor of the Oval Office. Like, we need it all now. And that's pretty demanding, actually, for any individual president to have to, live up to. So
it seems like we turned a corner a little bit with Obama then in the photography, making the president more accessible, but at the same time still trying to manage the character image, right? Trump, interestingly, lets us into his personal life through his tweets, right? Whereas Obama was doing it through these photographs. But Trump was being very guarded then about the photographs that he allowed. Yeah, I mean, it is really interesting. And in some ways you can say that the Twitter Trump and the photography Trump were different, which, I did just say. But there's also a way that they're kind of the same, because if you look at the photographs they made of Trump, again, the official photographs produced by his own photographers, they are mostly of grip and grins, right? They're mostly of these public events where he's giving the thumbs up and smiling. He's almost always posing for the camera. There's I think of Reagan doing that a lot too, by the way. And then the difference is you also had, they weren't always released in real time, right, before the era of social media. But with someone like Reagan, Gerald Ford, his incredible photographer, David Hume Kennerly, who's an amazing photojournalist and photographer, they showed a lot of behind the scenes, right? And so presidential photographers have been doing more of that. Trump just did not give his photographers that kind of access. Interesting. You talk about the Washington Monument in your book. There's a secret that you have to share with us. Would you like to explain that? Yeah, so we talked a little bit about how, surprisingly, George Washington becomes important for photography. And one of the things I learned while researching the book was that when the Washington Monument cornerstone was laid, many things were put into the cornerstone, kind of like a time capsule. And one of those things was daguerreotypes of paintings of George Washington and Mrs. Washington. Mm-hmm. And the second thing was instructions for how to make a daguerreotype. And this was fascinating to me because it pointed to this idea, if you think about a time capsule as like,
what's the newest technology of 1848, right, which is
Right.
when this was, you would say, oh, well, we know how to make these daguerreotypes now. But then to kind of prove the importance of the daguerreotype and tie it to Washington, for whom this monument's being built,
Right.
we include these. So you don't include a daguerreotype of an actual person, which is like the whole, the glory of
Yeah,
photography
yeah.
is like a live
interesting.
person's photograph. No, you photograph, you make a daguerreotype of a portrait and put that in there. So to me, that anecdote, literally, was the kind of cornerstone of that point, that photography and the presidency have just been really tied up with one another from the very beginning.
Yeah, that's been a really interesting topic to discuss. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Cara Finnegan for joining us today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.